The basic responsibility of Ernie Oney was to know Iran, where it came from, where it was, and by implication where it was going. CIA was not often asked to produce policy papers. Okay. Yes, we did the special national intelligence estimates when there was a problem of some kind, and national intelligence estimate on a periodic basis on major issues or countries or areas or global problems. But it was the responsibility of the Department of State and the National Security Council, to an extent the agency also contributing, to provide predictions of things. The basic problem, I think, is, again, the bearer of bad news. What do you do with information that suggests you have a real problem? What kind of policy impact does it have? Who has the guts to change the policy? When that's a little unfair. There are a lot of things going. It's like a wife who can't cook. She may be beautiful and charming and loving and a good mother, but her spaghetti tastes like hell. Well, that's okay. So much for that. Or there may be a different constellation of attributes and characteristics that you accept. And U.S. policy toward any country is wrapped up in all those things. So someone can come along, as many did, and I think Jim Bill was one, who was sharply critical of a given facet of American policy, in this case toward Iran. But Bill didn't have to balance the other things that were involved. All he had to do was know what was going on to the best of his ability, and yes, point the finger at this and that. But there were many benefits that came from the Iranian-American relationship, which one might evaluate this way or that way, but which were real and led to the specific policy. The old German said, for every effect there's a good and sufficient cause. And to see American government officials as charlatan mountebanks and superficial jerks is just kind of missing the point. Anyway, in the case of Ernie Oney, Ernie, I thought, was a great interlocutor. He and I had many long discussions of what it all meant and who was on first and what the changes were and why. And I found him a very knowledgeable and sympathetic person. Sympathetic in the context of our discussion today. He did understand the opposition to the degree that you can understand anything strictly from reading papers. That it's a long way from, again, the smell, the bizarre, the ground truth, to an office in Washington. As a historian, you understand that. If you could have had lunch with Louis XIV, you'd know a lot more about his life than you ever will know any other way. Okay? Yeah. Now, making love is different from reading about making love.
Now, when Oney worked on these NIE reports, intelligence estimates on Iran, did you collaborated with him on these reports? So?
Not as such. We had long talks. Mm-hmm. He had all the reports that had been written, not during my time, but period, were available. So only in that indirect sense collaboration.
So he provided information that he could use to bring to bear.
I'll give you an example of the kind of thing I've been trying to describe. There's a paper being written, a government-wide NIE, and there was some on Iran and military assistance to Iran, the implications of it. And there were a whole lot of implications, not just military and not just financial, but political and all kinds of other things. And there was a room full of maybe 60 people. The issue of our providing technicians to support the F-4s came up. And someone in the room said, there have been a couple of artillery exchanges on the Iraqi border. Of course, there always are, and the Shabalata and so forth. And the question was raised, should Iran and Iraq go to war, and we have American technicians servicing the F-4s, which surely the Shaw would use, I assume, does that make us a co-belligerent? If that should arise, a war did break out, what would we do? Would we leave them there and possibly be described in international law as co-belligerents, or would we pull them out much to the Shaw's chagrin, or would we come up with another solution? The issue was tabled because no one had an answer to that. Okay? What do you do in the face of that? Now that you're here and you've got your hand around the tar baby's throat, how are you going to get rid of it? How do you solve that kind of implication to a policy? Very complex. Now, Jim Bill doesn't have to deal with things like that. But certainly he could point out the implications that here is a problem. Okay. So it's a very large tapestry you're dealing with. You cut one thread and you've got a problem. And in pursuit of policy toward any country, there's an awful lot of things going on. An awful lot of pluses and an awful lot of minuses. The issue I think you're driving at, though, is what do we do about political opposition, the instability that produced the revolution in '79, and of course that's another 16 days discussion. A lot, or a little.
Now, you mentioned earlier, you were talking about these reports were prepared, the NIEs, among other things, that there was a tendency to write to suit the needs of the policymakers who supported the Shah and wanted a strong relationship with the Shah. And so
well, not necessarily.
Okay.
My view of the agency's analytic efforts were that you had a professional paper produced. The people in the analytic side of the agency, in my view, were true professionals. They were within the limits of their knowledge and accepting human predilection always, you know, values like democracy, values like political representation, and so on. They were truly professional and objective pieces of work. You did have problems when you had multi-agency contributions, because the Pentagon might view a country as an indispensable military asset, bases or something. State Department might view it as a great liability because of other aspects. The agency might have separate parochial interests. So when you tried to marry these at a top level, yes, you had problems. And it really came down finally to the question of dissents, appendices. I don't agree with the position on page 44 for the following reason. Or during the meeting, so-and-so threw up and became very angry and stormed and cursed and said this is insane. Dissenting views, dissenting positions. And there was scope for that. That is, programmatic, scheduled scope for that. The effort to ameliorate, that is, to blend all these into a single paper took a lot of dancing. It's like a bill that Congress passed. There are not a lot of interests that take it away from some ideal solution. In regard to the possible, although that is not really relevant to this, the preparation of NIEs. But every year the paper the Pentagon and the intelligence community does on Soviet force structure. Imagine the compromises that go into that. And people with dearly held specific and justifiable defendable positions may have their views either watered down or even eliminated. And maybe that's right and maybe that's wrong. You know that only in retrospect. But it's tough to produce an NIE on a controversial subject and get it right because of conflicting interests. The agency at one point, of course, was chartered to produce them without input from others. But now the military has an intelligence structure larger than the agency. And so there's problems with trying to get it right, quote unquote, right. I used to argue like hell with people in the station on particular points of view that I held vis-a-vis Iran. I'm not God, and who knows whether I was right. I certainly believe them, and they certainly believe contrary views.
Now, one point that James Bill makes in his book is that the division in the agency between the analytical wing and the operational wing caused problems for the Iran branch, for Olney's branch. And that the analysts felt that the operatives were withholding information, or vice versa. Was this a problem that you ever encountered during your years in language?
Well, I guess in passing I would note that I presume Jim is reflecting comments made by people in the analytic side, because he, I'm sure, didn't know a great deal about the relationship.
That's right, I'm sure.
It is to note that there is certainly a distinctive benefit in having the two branches separate. That is, the analysts writing their own pieces and not being second-guessed or vetoed or whatever by people on the operational side, or vice versa. It does, at least in theory, contribute to a more objective piece of paper. You get pretty passionately involved in the country. You devote a substantial part of your life to. Substantial meaning 3, 4, 5 years. And yes, people do get personally involved. Why not? And how else could you sustain a level of interest necessary to do what's supposed to be done? The other side of that is, yes, you're trying to get an objective analysis produced. Anyway, the division between the two was formal in the sense that the analyst wrote the paper, but often an analyst would say this, and I want to have lunch with you tomorrow. I've got a passage in the paper I'm producing. I'm really not terribly sure about it. I'd like to go over it with you. Or you'd sit down in an office and talk for 4 or 5 hours. What is it really like? What is this guy's personality really when you get down to it? Where is he coming from? What does he really want? How corrupt is he? How much power does he have? And there were very lengthy, detailed discussions that took place between the Directorate of Operations personnel and Directorate of Intelligence personnel. But again, that was often a function of friendships or personal relationships, personality. A lot of people in the Directorate of Operations are extremely aggressive and opinionated. That doesn't make for a terribly fertile dialogue. And an analyst who runs into a situation like this isn't going to spend a lot of time with a person like that. Because really what you're trying to do is find out what reality is, not what your opinion of reality is. But hours and hours and hours of dialogue and conversation over dinner, over beers, over lunch, feet up, chewing on things. What do you think this means? What are the implications of this? But again, not formalized. Yes, you debrief people who came back from overseas. There'd be a formal debriefing. But I'm talking about discussions in much greater depth than that. Jim, I'm sure, and others have commented on the problem that exists. As far as withholding is concerned, yes, that's another issue. If you're writing a paper, and here are 3 reports on the Mujahideen Khalq and their activities in Mashhad, or Mashhad is a religious center of Mujahideen activity. And the analyst says to you, how reliable is this source? You know, this is pretty hot stuff if it's true. Who is the guy? Well, I'm not going to tell you who the guy is. How can I gauge the credibility? Well, I'll tell you how to gauge the credibility. Indirect as opposed to direct sourcing. Okay. So if you want to know what I had for breakfast, you can ask my wife or you can ask me. If you ask me, within limits, I may or may not tell you the truth, but probably will. Why not? And this was one of the problems the analysts had, but there were awfully good reasons for that.
This is probably true throughout the agency, not just around but any company.
Oh, sure,
yeah,
sure.
Right.
The Director of Operations is enjoined by Congress in the establishment of the agency protecting sources and methods. You ask, will I just name the Mullah site? Yeah. Hell no. I mean, I wouldn't dare do that. I wouldn't dream of doing that. And in the same sense, there was a conflict between the analysts who wanted to know the last bit of information they could get to gauge the accuracy of the intelligence. I don't blame them at all for that. the difference between a director of operations, collector of intelligence from a given person, and the analyst who writes it, the paper based on that intelligence, and the scholar who talks with people because they are willing to talk with them. They all have problems. They all have problems. And the scholar not the least of them. A coup takes place, and in some obscure part of the world, it happened in Kabul at one point. Into Kabul, from all over the world, Paris, Beirut, New Delhi, wherever they happen to be, come the world press. And they fly into the country, they don't speak the local language, they're damn tired, they've just stopped something in midstream, a marriage, a birth, something. They've got dysentery or diarrhea or headaches or malaria or whatever it may be. They're there 3 days, they go home right to work. And out from the New York Times comes a 5-column article on the coup in Kabul. And it might be reality, and it might be junk. Old story that Nkrumah tells. Nkrumah was the ruler of Ghana, and of course he claimed to have had a mistress and claimed at one point to have gotten her a golden bed. And there was an attempted coup, and the generals were arrested and hung or shot or something. The press flew in like bees around honey. And the apocryphal story is that one of the American reporters, being American reporters, was very persistent and aggressive and one might say obnoxious. Finally, Nkrumah turned to him and said, "How long have you been here?" Well, he happened to have been there 3 weeks, much longer than the others, by some circumstance. And he rather proudly said, "Well, President Nkrumah, I've been here 3 weeks." And Nkrumah said, "Oh, thank God, too long to write a book." So scholars have problems. And they can be just as bamboozled as anybody that walks the street. You know what the problem is of what is the truth, capital T. It is different.
Now, when you're in the operational side of things in Langley, how would you describe your duties?
You support operations, you interface with other government agencies, you interface with the analysts, you are the person who speaks for that desk or that branch on matters that pertain to the operational side or to some degree the intelligence side.
Of course, you monitor the reports on the field that come out.
You monitor the whole stream of traffic, operational, intelligence, administrative, personnel, the whole thing.
When you're in Langley at this stage, in the early 70s, how useful was the information you were getting back from Tehran about opposition and internal politics?
Well, as I say, I think we were weak. I think the agency was weak in that, and I think it reflected the amount of resources they committed, the quality of people they sent.
Now, at what point did Sunday, I think Bill makes this in his book, is it during this period in 79, the CIA had, and I guess NSA had monitoring sites in northern Iran that were used to monitor Soviet missile tests. Mm-hmm. They were considered a very important strategic asset. And the point is made, I think, that there was reluctance that ambassadors and others were reluctant to encourage contacts with the opposition because they were fearful the Shah would get angry and thereby and perhaps cut off these monitoring stations.
I'm sure that was a concern. Why not?
I mean, how legitimate do you think it was as a concern?
I don't think it's legitimate, but if I expressed that earlier when I said any ambassador who accepts a limitation on embassy contacts, I think is a fool. Because once you do it, that's it. Now, try Moscow. They go at it a different way. You can see anybody you want. You don't mind seeing them hang by the feet 3 days later. So there are a lot of ways to go about it, but I think any ambassador or any government who even starts down that path has made a critical and in some ways irrevocable mistake. Because having made that mistake, what ambassador is going to say, I made a mistake? Okay? Would the Shah have closed down the monitoring sites? I don't think so.
He found them useful himself.
I mean, Christ almighty, we play poker, don't we? All right? Are you going to raise? Are you going to fold? Are you going to call? We should play better poker. We should play a lot better poker than that. We should run some risk, but we're not a risk-taking country. We're not a risk-taker in our policy. We're not a risk-taker in our personnel. not a risk taker in our decisions. Look at congressional legislation. Look at gun control. We don't take risks. We are, I think, in many dimensions a status quo power. Everything that perturbates what we think is a comfortable situation is a problem for us. A problem for Congress, a problem for the executive branch. It is a mindset.
Well, sometimes risks are taken to maintain the status quo. I mean, for that example, Vietnam would be considered to be a risk. How great was a great risk at the time that...
Well, let's not go there. That's another 6 days.
Yeah, that's another question.
But
mind.
let me go back to it. Back to your question on the sites and the policy.
Okay.
There are a lot of things to say about Vietnam, but I don't think that you can say legitimately that the people who framed the policy in Vietnam were mountebank charlatans, murderers, and fools who sought out pregnant women to shoot. Disagreements, yes. But again, for every effect there's a good and sufficient cause. There are reasons why people do things, and whether they're right or not will be judged only in retrospect. But they do things for what they think are good reasons. They may be noble or ignoble, wise or foolish. But the fact remains that governments don't come up with big policies like Vietnam or protection of the collection sites without having thought about it. It isn't just an irrational, off the top of the head decision. It is true that the Soviet Union, maybe even today, is the only country that can destroy the United States. And it is not irrelevant that we spend a lot of time and attention on that subject. And one of the ways they could do it was with missiles. And one of the ways we could keep in touch with what they're doing with the collection sites. There's a lot more to say than that, but there is that to say.
Well, from what I've read, I think what I've been told as well, this information was shared with the Shah routinely anyway, so he would have had less reason to close it down.
Could be.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much information on Soviet missile technology the Shah really was interested in, but anyway, I think you do. I think you play hardball when you have to play hardball, and I think you run risk. The world's a risky place. It isn't a risk. It's even a risky place in the Mission Street or down in South Central Los Angeles. It's risky on Highway 101 at 5 o'clock. But we do have a problem of consensus, and we do have a problem of the implications of serious actions that we take. And again, for all the criticism one might level on any policy, invasion of Grenada, trying to get Noriega out, what to do about Nicaragua, how to treat Gorbachev's perestroika, what to do about the Shah, how much value to place on the collection sites, how much resources to commit to coverage of internal opposition in Iran, how much money to spend on training Iranian linguists or area specialists. This is all of a piece, and you make decisions. I don't have a Ferrari. I'd love to have a Ferrari, but, part of that money is going to educate the kids. These are trade-offs, and we make them all the time. So whether it's wise or not, I go back to it. I think you take risks. I think you gamble. And I think you say, okay, it's worth it. And, of course, you gauge the likelihood. But most ambassadors are very, very conservative. Not on my watch is not unusual. I've served with only 2 ambassadors I thought had real guts in terms of policy issues and willingness to commit themselves to a change of course or to an unpopular policy. And I thought those ambassadors were absolutely superb.
Who were they?
Henry Byron.
In Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan. They had great courage and would buck the trends based on what he is, which is the president's representative in a country. There should be no one who understands that country better than he does, who is more keenly interested in it, who has as his primary objective the pursuit of American interests.
And the other person was
a fellow who was in Khartoum when I was there, one of the old school. A very fine person. fine person, I mean, who had the courage of his convictions and would pursue them, even at the risk of saying, you remember that report I gave you last? That's wrong. I made a mistake. This is what's happening, and this is what we should do. Washington comes back and says, oh, no, we don't need that. That's good. Stop making all those waves. The boat is rocking. That's enough. Most ambassadors say, yes, sir. That probably isn't fair, but it's something like that.
Now, in your branch of CIA, was there an Iran section as such?
Of course.
And were you the chief person, or was there another person that was your superior?
I ran the branch for a while.
Okay. Do you think how many people worked in that branch?
No,
Yeah.
not enough.
Not enough. Okay. Now, 7 months after you left Iran, President Nixon traveled to Tehran on his way back from the Moscow summit.
Mm-hmm.
And at the meeting, the Shah requested CIA help on organizing a Kurdish insurgency against the government of Iraq. Now, I've read that the officers at the station in Tehran and elsewhere in CIA were rather unhappy or critical with this assignment. What were your thoughts about this question?
Well, I'd just soon not express them.
Okay. How much working knowledge does the CIA have about the Kurds as a nationality in Iran and in the region?
The Kurds have been a major player in the affairs in that part of the world for a good many years. Barzani and family and allies were one part of it, and Telegani and some of the others were playing other roles. That is, came from other places. Part of it was traditional, and Kurds have never been known to get along terribly well with each other, and they're a power to be reckoned with. They live in an area which is relatively inaccessible. If someone is opposed to them or wants to overthrow them, or put them down, or make allies of them, it's kind of hard to get them. They were a power, and they were quite well known. Barzani, of course, had lived in Russia for a long time. Some of his lieutenants had. I think there was a good understanding of the Kurds, nationalistic intentions, though there were many Kurds and many different intentions, and power plays going on all the time. But that's, well, I think if you go back to the time of the establishment of the Mughal Empire and its successors, or to the time when Cyrus married the daughter of the king of the Medes, they've been there a long time, and not much has changed. Fascinating. I mean, shows the world is as it is. The persistence of pattern. There's an article not long ago, some magazine friend sent me a clipping about the Middle East, the wars in the Middle East being the actual first round of the Third World War. And I wrote him back a couple of pages saying, if your thesis is correct, if you agree with this article, then your Third World War began about 6000 BC, because it's been going on all that long. Same players, same places, same delectable circumstances and relationships. That may change over time. I mean, if we all get television sets and paved roads or something. But as long as you have mountains and tribes and rivalries and an urge to power, I don't see that you're going to change the pattern. So the Kurds are part of it. And the Assyrians and the Chaldeans and the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Medes and the Persians and all the rest. So my view about the Kurds is, yes, they were a very interesting group. They had a very interesting territorial situation of interest to Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Soviet Union. And I think within limits, what lies in a human's heart, they were reasonably well understood.
Now, during the early 1950s, I guess late 40s, the CIA in Tehran had a fairly substantial network of contacts with Iranian nationals, Khazari, and the government, the clergy, and elsewhere. To what extent did that kind of a network of contacts and agents and sub-agents continue on into the 60s and early 70s?
Well, surely it continued in kind, but surely also it was diminished very markedly in number. American interests were very different in the 60s and 70s than they were in the 40s and 50s. Second World War, the Soviet seizure of Azerbaijan, the whole question of what our relationship with the Soviets would be, 48, the Stuttgart speech by Burns, the Cold War, all these things were happening. Iran was a very unstable country, and when the oil crisis arose, so-called oil crisis, and the Mossadegh nationalization of the oil companies, all kinds of other interests came to play. The Seven Sisters dominated American policy in the Middle East to a great extent because the Americans had very little else of interest to them in the 40s and the early 50s. We didn't know much about the Middle East. Israel was a major concern, and we knew a good deal about Israel, but we didn't know much about other things. We had Germans and Frenchmen and Czechs and Poles and Russian exiles in the United States, and they constituted lobbies and wrote books and talked to Congress, and the Cold War generated, the focus of the Cold War was Europe, not the Middle East. And our attitude toward the Middle East and the Third World was very much the anti-colonial attitude. It flowed after the Second World War in Indonesia and Indochina and the breakup of the mandates. We didn't know a lot about Iran. We became very concerned about it, intensified by the nationalization of the oil fields. We began, in part because of the Tehran Conference during the war, to try to become interested. Made a major effort to understand Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Iraq, etc. But we were just at the beginning stages of that, really. We saw a threat, we saw a significant problem, geopolitical, financial, economic, and committed a great many resources, people, time, money, into trying to achieve stability in Iran. And in anything like a historical perspective, that was accomplished. Somewhat forgotten in most commentaries on U.S. policy in Iran. Yes, that objective was accomplished. It was accomplished from the time Mossadegh's removal from office until 1979. That's, round numbers, a quarter of a century. Not bad, everything considered. In the 7,000-year life of the Middle East, nothing. But one really does have to look at what was happening in the world in the early 50s, and the Berlin airlift, and the crisis in Greece, the whole question of whether there would be a communist presence in the Adriatic and all. A lot of things were happening there. Indo-Pak situation was absolutely exploding. The world's a complex place. There were a lot of things that American policymakers were concerned with. One of them was Iran. That had to be fixed. It was fixed in the last 25 years. It's lasted a lot longer than the mullahs have lasted. Okay, and maybe the mullahs and typically toward the United States will last another, what would it be, 16 years? I doubt it, but it might. The world was awash with problems at the time of Mossadegh. Problems for the United States. One should go back and look at that. Engaging whether the policy was wise.
You mentioned a minute ago one issue that's worth looking at is the question of the American presence in Iran during this period, the late 60s into the 70s. You thought it was worth discussing how Americans behaved or acted in that country. What are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I don't know the numbers of Americans there. That should be easily available.
Yeah.
I've seen estimates, but I don't know. There were several thousand Americans there, most of them in the contractual context. And most of those related to military contracts. Building systems, providing training, so on. For the most part, this very large group of Americans were there to make money, or they were there because of the business community, or they were there because they were assigned the U.S. military. Thousands of them in villages, in the bazaar, in the better neighborhoods in town. The oil people came along and kicked the price of housing so high that the government had to subsidize housing for its employees because they couldn't afford to live there otherwise.
Was this true when you were there?
Yes.
70, 71? Yeah.
I moved there in '68 and took over a house. I'd gone over early to try to find a house, and the embassy said, well, there's one guy leaving, you might want to talk with him. It was a house that more or less fit my family. And he said, well, I'm sure that he would like to rent to Americans because they keep the property up well and they pay their bills. But I've got to warn you, the price of the house doubled when I rented it 3 years ago, and my guess is you'll want to double it again this time. Which in fact turned out to be the case. And when I left, another American family came in and doubled them. We're talking about doubling in cost every 2 or 3 years. So that was a real problem for everybody. The Americans basically were not there and were not particularly interested in developing an understanding or a taste, a sense of Iranian culture or Iran as such. They lived pretty much, well, to the degree they could, as they would in Keokuk or San Francisco or Chicago. They wanted a bowling alley, they wanted hamburgers and bingo nights at the officers' club, this kind of thing. And tragically, they, in my view, they missed this tremendous possible exposure to one of the world's great cultures. Rarely did they learn the language or try to learn the language. They were truly ugly Americans, in my view. And the impact of this at a basic level was very negative. We were seen as being cultural barbarians, so to speak, of being a people who were intensely concerned with money, who had almost no interest in Iran as such, or the Iranian people, or their patterns, their culture, their poetry, whatever. People would go down to see the crown jewels, but they wouldn't go to the Bostan Museum, which is surely one of the great museums in the world. They rarely traveled outside Tehran. They didn't come to understand the country, which is all right. I mean, you know, you don't have to, but you missed a great bet. And cumulatively, this had a negative impact on the Iranian view of the Americans. There was a case, they had, again, to provide education for these thousands of American children who were there, they built the American school. Government, U.S. government money, as they often do in foreign countries. We came late after the school year had started, so we had to put the kids in the only available school to us, which was the American school, and we, that summer after the first year, attended a PTA meeting or equivalent there. They had a new headmaster, and an American who'd been, an Iranian who'd been educated in the United States, was teaching at Tehran University, got up and made a very graceful presentation saying that the University of Tehran would provide teachers, as many as required, to teach Persian as a language, and or to teach a course in Iranian cultural history, which I would have been very happy to take. He then sat there while a series of speakers got up, one of whom was a gentleman from the military. He said, I didn't bring my kids here to learn Persian, and I am not interested in Persian culture. What good will that do my child in getting a job or anything else? The time he would spend learning the cultural history of Iran, he should spend learning math or American history or American politics or something. So a vote was taken, and his offer was turned down by a substantial margin. That led me to pull the kids out of that school and put them in another school in town because I was absolutely infuriated American community would pass up an opportunity like this. That tended to characterize the American indifference toward Iran, and there was a cumulatively very negative impact of this, because it wasn't just seen to be, it actually was a matter of viewing the Persians as just so far beneath us that there was no communication, and there wasn't. It was a great tragedy with significant impact. And the mullahs spoke of it. The Americans and their motorcycles and their booze and their gals and their bingos and their luau's and their separate officers' clubs and so on.
In your conversations with them?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And so did everybody else. What a great... Now, maybe there's nothing we can do about it. Americans are Americans. They act crazy ways in San Francisco. But it reflected kind of an unspoken attitude toward Iran. Well, it wasn't unspoken, it was spoken. Which both reflected some myopia on our part and had a very negative impact on all levels of relationship, let alone communication, between the American community and Iranians. It was a very negative fact. Some of the other things that were happening at the time, we don't read signals very well. In '63 there were several riots in which American cars were overturned. Things happened that were quite negative. Nobody that I talked to seemed to understand what that meant. It was as though it didn't happen. And when I would discuss that issue in the context of opposition,
the 63 events.
In the context of that event, that was about 10 years after Mossadeg's overthrow, and some 8 years, 6-8 years. How an event that significant could be simply done away with, forgotten, I will never understand. Dick Cotton covered that quite well. And in part, when that kind of thing happens and you go to someone and you say, what did this mean? Do you get anything, a Spitzelgefühl from that? And the answer is, what events? It tends to make you think, was it Talleyrand said of the Bourbons, we forget nothing and we learn nothing? Events like that have significance. Like the Watts riots, for example. They are significant. They have meanings. They reflect realities. But we didn't pick up on that. And there were other events like that.
Around the time you were in Iran?
Well, some Americans were killed. How about that?
Was that
to start with, that was a political act.
Because that was after you had left. Am I mistaken about
These
that?
things were happening. There one lieutenant colonel had been killed. That, of course, is obvious, and people did focus on it. But they didn't. What did it mean? Well, they gave it different meanings and probably significantly undervalued that. You had to have that kind of mindset. What is it they say? Seek and you shall find. If you believe something, you can find all kinds of evidence to support it. If you don't believe it, then everything that's adduced is not relevant or different. People keep saying it's different. Oh, that's different. Sure, it's different. We didn't read that very well. And in part because of the ghetto mentality of most of the Americans in India.
Now, in terms of the way Americans behaved on the streets, the things you talked about earlier, were there efforts made by the embassy to try to
Nominal.
Get the Americans to behave differently?
Nominal. It's a bit like, I don't know what it's silly.
Okay.
That was a huge community we were, a huge community. You couldn't tell an American businessman anything. In some ways, you couldn't tell the American military advisory group anything. They were run from the Pentagon, separate track, had their own validity, their own corruption.
This raises a question in my mind. One issue that concerned the State Department in the 70s was the extent to which Armishmag would not provide intelligence information on the various personnel in the Iranian military. And Armishmag was very reluctant to provide such information. Were there efforts made in the station to encourage them to provide information as well?
There's some efforts made, but the policy of our Mishmag was that they would not do that because that would jeopardize their relationships with their military counterparts.
And that's pretty much where the issue was left.
Well, that's where it began.
Yeah.
No change was made in that policy.
Uh-huh.
I was in another country at one point when a very critical event was about to take place, and an American who was there could have provided extremely important information to the U.S. government of geopolitical significance. And I went to see him, and I had talked to his boss and said, with your approval, I'll ask him the following, because he could really provide us a tremendous amount of help. He said, well, all right, but he's on his own. He can say yes or no. And I said, I understand that. So I went for him. I explained what was happening and his role in this, the possibility he could make a cardinal contribution. And he stood up quite unhappy and he said, Mr. Dole, I came here to help these people, not to spy on them, which is kind of a classic American attitude toward the world. And I said, fine, then I take it what you're saying is no. He said, not only no, but hell no. Fair enough. That is an American attitude toward intelligence, toward information, which is fairly congenital. It's the idea that Big Brother is quite a menacing figure.